Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. This is a really exciting conference for me because it brings together everything I'm interested in: language, cultural anthropology, Eurasia, and borders. While the theme of this conference is very close to my heart, language script is not something I've written much about, so I'm really looking forward to learning more about the topic and about parts of Eurasia I'm less familiar with. I'm very thankful to all the participants for enthusiastically accepting my invitation, and I want to thank in particular Peter and Matteo, who suggested scholars to extend an invitation to, and without whom some of the important scholarship on this topic would have been missed. As the papers presented today would show, a change of script is a very loaded decision. It has meaning for how a community sees itself, what it tries to project, and what it seeks in terms of geopolitical orientation. This geopolitical component is very timely as we see the political arena becoming reconfigured, with new alliances emerging and old partnerships falling away. While the initial idea for this conference was the cultural and linguistic repercussions of Russia's war in Ukraine, it would also illuminate dynamics elsewhere in the world. The first part of the day will focus on Kazakhstan, while in the afternoon we'll hear papers about Turkmenistan, Yugoslavia, Mongolia, and Tatarstan. Our first presenter today is Alina Kamalova, who will be presenting remotely from England. Hi, Alina. Dr. Kamalova is a lecturer in sociolinguistics at Süleyman Demirel University and has recently been appointed as a lecturer in Russian and Eurasian studies at Queen Mary University of London. She earned her PhD in sociolinguistics from the University of Edinburgh, where she investigated the construction of conservative and misogynistic ideologies in Russian media. Dr. Kamalova's research explores the intricate relationships between language and broader social structures, with a particular focus on identity construction and language ideologies. Alina, the floor is yours.
Great. So, dear colleagues, I'm so pleased to be here with all of you today, even online, and I'd like to thank Frank for inviting me. Looking at the impressive lineup of speakers, many of whom I've had the privilege of getting to know, I'm confident we are in for a very engaging and productive discussion on language policies in Kazakhstan. Today, I will be discussing the construction of language ideologies in Kazakhstan's social media, particularly during the war in Ukraine. In this research, I aimed to explore the social-linguistic consequences of the massive exodus of Russian citizens that followed Vladimir Putin's announcement of the partial mobilization of military reservists in September 2022. Over 100,000 Russian citizens arrived in Kazakhstan during this time, and many have remained in the country. And my work focuses on understanding how these events impacted language ideologies in Kazakhstan. So let's begin by looking at the broader context of Kazakhstan today. Kazakhstan is a multi-ethnic, predominantly bilingual country with a trilingual policy in place, and scholars have addressed various tensions in Kazakh society between civic and ethnic identities, rural and urban populations, Kazakh-speaking and Russian-speaking groups. However, I believe significant historical events like wars or large migration waves add new layers of complexity to this existing dynamics.
Recording in progress.
Before delving into my findings, I'd like to provide a brief historical overview to set the stage for today's discussion. Since my talk focuses on language ideologies, I will begin with the working definition. Judith Irvine, in her seminal work, describes language ideology as the cultural or subcultural system of ideas about social and linguistic relationships, together with the loading of moral and political interests. Thune van Dijk further complements this by defining it as a group's shared ideas about the relationship between linguistic and social-cultural features. Now let's move to the historical context. Soviet language policy is often cited as one of the most deliberate language policies in the world. However, it was riddled with contradictions. Looking at its trajectory over the decades, these contradictions become clear. At the beginning of the 20th century, most Kazakhs were educated in Islamic schools or medrese, where Arabic was the primary language of instruction. During the Tsarist period, the Russian Empire established a few Russo-Kazakh schools in key areas like Orenburg, Omsk, Semipalatinsk to promote Russian influence. After the 1917 revolution, there was a push for Russification to unify the Soviet state. But by the 1920s, the policy of Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, was introduced. And this aimed to promote local languages, cultures, and identities within Soviet republics, fostering this ethnic pride while still aligning with Soviet ideals. So throughout the 20th century, these policies oscillated. The Cyrillic alphabet was adopted, yet Kazakh language schools grew in rural areas. Urban populations were largely Russified, while Kazakh-speaking elites were promoted in state structures. By the late Soviet period, Russian had become a form of economic, cultural, and symbolic capital, to borrow Bourdieu's terms. And Russian speakers were more likely to access higher education and climb the career ladder. So this historical backdrop brings us to the post-Soviet period where, as Marlene L'Oreal observes, Kazakhs were among the titular nationalities in the USSR with the lowest national language fluency and the highest use of Russian. After independence in 1991, the Kazakh government had made efforts to promote the Kazakh language. The 1995 constitution designated Kazakh as the state language, symbolizing independence and cultural revival. And Russian was granted official status as a language of inter-ethnic communication, reflecting the country's multi-ethnic makeup and aiming to maintain social cohesion. In 2017, the government announced the transition of the Kazakh script from Cyrillic to Latin, a significant reform which we will be discussing today. So additionally, trilingual education, Kazakh, Russian, and English became a priority to prepare citizens for global opportunities. And during Nazarbayev presidency, there were policies aimed at reviving Kazakh identity and diminishing the Russian-Soviet legacy. And this included renaming of streets, altering surnames to remove Russian suffixes from Adiletov to Adilet, let's say, and introducing the Latin script, which is widely used, I think, by the small and young businesses today in Kazakhstan. However, scholars note Kazakization is contentious. Does it mean diversification? Does it prioritize ethnic Kazakh identity over a broader civic Kazakhstani identity? And these questions remain unresolved. So when we talk about this tension between ethnic identity, usually tied to being Kazakh-speaking, and civic identity, which doesn't necessarily require Kazakh language use, it's important to trace this back to the late 1980s. And we can all think about the Желтоқсан events, for example. And around that time, nationalism really started to dominate public discussions, especially when it came to shaping language policies. Ernest Gellner famously defined nationalism as the idea that the political and cultural unit should be congruent. In other words, for a nation to feel complete, its political identity should align with its cultural one. And this idea was the driving force behind giving official status to titular languages in ex-Soviet republics. And it came straight out of this ideology of linguistic nationalism. Basically, the national identity is expressed through its language, then making that language official reinforces the sense of who we are as a people. But today, things are a lot more complicated. We are seeing all these overlapping tensions. Kazakh versus Kazakhstani, Islam versus Tengriism, Eurasian versus Turanian, Kazakh-speaking versus Russian-speaking, urban versus rural, and even the divide between Navas Kazakh, authentic Kazakh, and Shala Kazakh, incomplete or mixed Kazakh identities. So the process of relearning Kazakh for the Russified population is still ongoing, and this dynamic shaped by political and historical circumstances, has led to distinctions between these two identities, pure Kazakh and Shala Kazakh, and that these distinctions play out both linguistically and socially. On this slide, you will see Marlene L'Oreal's explanation of these two varieties and how they can be differentiated, as she puts it. The use of the adjective nafas, real Kazakhs, to define Kazakhs who have well preserved their identity, and Shala Kazakhs, for those who have lost it, has deteriorated into mutual accusations and a way to privilege certain categories of citizens. Shala Kazakh literally means half Kazakh, and is used to target Russophone and urban Kazakhs who are considered detached from their Kazakh-phone and rural roots. At the linguistic level, Shala Kazakhnas is often characterized by code switching between Kazakh and Russian, Russian-like pronunciation of Kazakh-specific sounds, and the accentuation or reduction of certain vowel sounds. To illustrate this, I will show you a short clip from the Salem social media platform and their famous Q0 series. In it, the linguistic traits associated with Shala Kazakhnas are not only highlighted but also ridiculed, particularly through the identity of a Kazakh deputy. I understand that not all may understand Russian and Kazakh or both, but we won't dive into this kind of, phonological or lexical analysis, but at least we all possibly can hear the code switching. So let me turn it on.
Природа. Sonra babasının kulübesinin baba başısına varayım ya sıkpa. Sıkpa da var. Onda ответ какой? Демография в гору вперед. Да? Правильно? Jackson. Природа. Sonra babasının kulübesinin
Essentially, the war in Ukraine and the influx of Russian migrants have intensified efforts to distance Kazakh identity from Russia's imperial and Soviet past, fueling a stronger sense of Kazakh linguistic nationalism. Let's explore the label Shala Kazakh in more detail. Similar to terms like Spanglish or broken English, this label does more than just describe language. It associates certain ways of speaking with images of the speaker, their social relationships, and broader cultural norms. In this context, both pure Kazakhs and Shala Kazakhs become imagined stereotypes. And this is where Aga's theory of enregisterment fits well. It explains how behaviors, linguistic or non-linguistic, or maybe both, become culturally significant and start representing stereotypic roles or relationships. Now let me briefly talk about methodology. To examine this phenomenon, I used a screen-based approach to analyze digital interactions on platforms like Instagram and YouTube. I collected data using export comments and focus on posts related to language practices and identity in Kazakhstan. The dataset includes 10 widely discussed Instagram posts and 1 YouTube music video, all from February 2022 to November 2023, and altogether 3,118 comments were collected for analysis. Here is a concrete example. So, Alina Shakiva, an ethnically Kazakh woman who lived in Moscow for 17 years, sang a Kazakh song, Uykum Kelmeydi, for the YouTube channel Toy Duman. And since its release in July 2022, the music video has amassed over 5.5 million views. However, the video also sparked criticism, with many comments focusing on Alina's Russian accent. Some said her singing was painful to hear, or claimed it sounds as if an Oriska is singing. And the term Oriska combines the Kazakh word Oris, meaning Russian, with the diminutive suffix k, often adding familiarity or disdain. And this criticism framed Alina's accent as not just unpleasant, but as a failure to uphold Kazakh linguistic and cultural purity. Other Kazakh comments again invoke the notions of clean Kazakh and expressed distress over Alina's Kazakh song, associating it with bringing disgraceful notoriety to Kazakhstan. They also used the word uyat, a significant cultural concept among Kazakhs, reserved for actions perceived as immoral or inhumane. And in this context, Alina, despite being ethnically Kazakh, is framed as acting immorally due to her inability to uphold the purity of the Kazakh language, thus affecting her perceived moral standing in society. Essentially, her Russian-inflected pronunciation while singing in Kazakh triggered ethnically based derogatory remarks predominantly expressed in Russian here. It can be seen in the last 3 comments. And in this sense, such shaming practices of an improper Kazakh use made in Russian can be viewed through the Bakhtin's notion of double voicing that helps to expose how people may express support for linguistic nationalism while still relying on the Russian language for practical reasons. This slide shows an Instagram post about the behavioral norms and speech guidelines in Kazakhstan published shortly after the arrival of Russian migrants. It was created by Nursultan Bagidullah, the creator of Kazakh Grammar Instagram page with over 70,000 followers, and the page is primarily focused on Kazakh language and social issues. As you can see, there are 8 points in the post, but for this analysis, I'm focusing on points 6 and 7, which address language use specifically. So point 6 here offers 3 magic words that will make you the most honored guest in Kazakhstan. Salametstvie, hello, rahmet, thank you, and savulnus, goodbye. These words are written in Kazakh, transcribed in Cyrillic, and then translated into Russian. And this emphasizes this kind of symbolic importance of Kazakh both for non-Kazakh speakers and ethnic Kazakhs. And even minimal use of the language carries significant weight here. Another paragraph in point 6 states this: as for the pronunciation of Kazakh words and names, you should not use the rules of the Russian language in relation to Kazakh. For example, in Kazakh words, the letter ye is read similarly to the Russian ye, not as e. Not tenge, but tenge. Not asel, but asel. The letter o in the unstressed position should be read not as a, but as o. Not adbase, but odbas. Not takaya, but tokaya. Knowledge of these linguistic nuances will accelerate your integration into Kazakh society. End of quote. And this comparison of the pronunciation of Kazakh vowels to their Russian counterparts serves to create socially and politically powerful differentials. As Irvine and Gall explain, the process of ideologizing difference occurs through comparison and has the following aspects: grammatization, axis of differentiation, fractal recursivity, and erasure. Grammatization, focusing on particular contrasts of quality, is observed in the comparison of similar vowel sounds in Russian and Kazakh that are pronounced differently in certain word positions in Kazakh. And the examples illustrate that the rule of reducing vowel sounds in pre-stress and post-stress positions in Russian cannot be directly applied to Kazakh words. While reducing Kazakh vowels does not typically cause comprehension issues, it may result in a Russian accent. Erasure can occur within the axis of differentiation, reducing it, ignoring or downplaying other contrasting elements. In our context, the discussion focuses solely on 2 vowel letters and sounds that are orthographically and phonologically easier to explain to Kazakh speakers, neglecting other specifically Kazakh letters, such as a, n, r, u, that are harder to pronounce. The correct pronunciation of these omitted elements significantly impacts meaning and poses greater challenges for learners of Kazakh. Essentially, the pronunciation rules of vowel sounds that Russian speakers might apply to Kazakh words written in a similar Cyrillic alphabet are positioned as a prerequisite for integration into Kazakhstani society and be viewed as stereotypical figures, according to which post-producers imagine the ways in which Russians speak and stereotypically do not expect them to linguistically assimilate to Kazakh speech norms. The seventh point from this post regulates the correct pronunciation of certain toponyms, which across all world languages exhibit the right pronunciation rules. For instance, Paris in English contrasting with the French Paris. Similar disparities occur with Moscow in English, Moscou in French, Moscow in Kazakh, or Moskva in Russian. And the central idea of this point is not about standard or received pronunciation, but it rather signifies a rejection of the Soviet past, viewed as a period marked by the imposition of colonial policies. In other words, the usage of the old pronunciation adopted in Soviet and early post-Soviet times, which can even be prioritized by some Kazakhs today. For example, in Almaty, you would probably hear Chimbulak instead of Shimbulak. So this pronunciation by relocated Russians is positioned as threatening or disrespectful to Kazakh people. Conversely, Russian-like pronunciation is depicted as a means to undermine the role and status of the Kazakh language as the country's state language. This post was published on the 4th of April 2022, causing heated and emotional debates in the comments section, leading the page author to eventually close the comments. And this did not help stop the heated discussions, which sometimes turned into personal attacks and insults, as the post had already been reposted across various private and public accounts, further amplifying its resonance. To conclude, I aimed to show how language ideologies in Kazakhstan are deeply connected to questions of national identity, political positioning, and the legacy of Soviet influence. I also aimed to show that linguistic and national identities are not static. They are co-constructed and constantly evolving and shaped by both top-down policies and grassroots dynamics. And these trends in the shift of Shala Kazakh enregisterment is not and never could be stable or completed. Rather, it is context-dependent and always in flux. Through the enregisterment of Shala Kazakh as a socially charged and ideologically loaded variant, Kazakh linguistic nationalism emerges as both a response to historical Russian dominance and as a statement of cultural self-determination. And recent political advances, war, mobilization, and migration have the consequential impact on the enregisterment of Shala Kazakhnas. Shala Kazakhnas not only became associated with not pure enough Kazakhnas, but also acquired even more complex connotations. It began to embody not just a lack of fluency, but a perceived alignment with pro-Russian sentiments, thereby invoking imperialist, threatening, and disrespectful associations towards users of the Kazakh language. Here are the references I used in this presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Any questions for Adina?
Yes, I was wondering if you could let us know what were the main comments under this post you shared, what people argued mostly about in this pamitka.
Right, so, as I mentioned, from my impression, as I watched and read them, they they were in the form of personal attacks and personal insults. And again, the position were, like, again, the debates there were into different sides. Those who said, like, okay, come on, we are Kazakhs and we are the people who are historically well known for their great level of hospitality. So let's be kind, let's just receive and accept all the people coming without this kind of posting this kind of rules of the proper behavior, right? And the other side were trying to just defend the position of being, again, this kind of threat, under threat of this historic Russian dominance, which again probably may continue with the war in Ukraine and with the migrants coming to Kazakhstan. And here you also maybe need to understand the context that this wave of migration changed certain economic, even economic realities on the ground. For example, the prices for the renting prices, they went incredibly high because of Russian relicants for the locals. The same happened with the job market. Some Russian relicants who, for example, IT specialists from Moscow were more prioritized among the Kazakh candidates. And this, of course, also fueled this kind of attitude, more negative or more aggressive attitude towards these migrants. And again, there was another, sorry if I'm talking too much, there was another scandal, maybe colleagues from Kazakhstan also may recall that, with one very well-known businessman whose name was Ramil Mukharyapov, and he is the head of Chokolaiv family in Kazakhstan's very successful business, and he had a certain meeting of this Russian relicants, explaining the peculiarities of the life in Kazakhstan. So when they were discussing this kind of language questions, he said to one of the migrants that if you his proposition was the following: we know that the majority of Kazakhs, they speak Russian, so when you address the ethnic Kazakh in Russian and hear the response in Kazakh, this is something from the absence of culture. So after him saying this, he was completely cancelled, and his businesses were cancelled. I mean, there was a huge scandal. So you can just imagine what kind of what the level of heated discussions this kind of thing generated, and of course that was very much related to language issues.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Quick question.
This is just for the video. The sound is picked up from that. So otherwise,
She may not be able
speak up.
Hi, Helena. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hi. My question is about decolonization. And I'm wondering, because we're using that term in English academia, what is the term being used in Kazakhstan?
Yeah, I mean, of course, a lot. And I think that it's a huge revival in the scholarship today, addressing this issue from various perspectives, history, politics, economics, and so on and so forth. And, it's kind of funny. I was just reading Madina Plastanova's book on that. And I just very much agree, probably, that this kind of post-socialist or post-communist identity is something different from the post-colonial identity, So this kind of, the main thing here, just maybe to understand this very, very thin layers of the meaning, that when post-socialist citizens were then merged with so-called global north, were, trying to enter certain Western countries, they were put on the same kind of scale as the post-colonial subalterns, right? But actually, it's these two kind of things have very different histories, very different consequences, So again, the term, just coming back to your question, the term decoloniality or decolonial is very much used to this kind of Kazakhstani discourse. But again, we need to remember that maybe not all these kind of epistemological frame goes within it when we talk about post-socialist countries.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Quick question, then we'll have to move on. Yeah?
Yeah, I'll try and make it quick.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Hi. You painted in the conclusion a shift from Shala Kazakhness from being not enough or some sort of insufficiently Kazakh to being one of seen as being more aligned with pro-Russian sentiment or an imperialist position. I was wondering if you could give a little bit, for instance, in the Uykum Kelmeda video, was that something that you saw in the comments, or were there other examples of what you see as this discursive shift?
Yeah, of course, sure. For example, again, the singer Alina in that video had this kind of Russian accent, and which was marked in the comments. And for example, the typical comment was there, like, okay, if you cannot learn Kazakh properly, if you have this kind of Russian style Kazakh, then go to Moscow and live there, like this kind of thing. So it's not again about her probably ethnicity, not the question of her ethnicity or like national identity, but rather this kind of like probably you don't respect as much as if you cannot speak clearly Kazakh language. So then again, probably her background, again, as I mentioned, she lived for a lot of years in Moscow. It also caused some kind of distress, like she didn't have this kind of effort. She didn't make this efforts to relearn, Kazakh and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina. There is Professor Juliz Magurova, who's a professor and founding dean of the College of Human Science, Kimep University, Almaty, Kazakhstan. She has an MA in linguistics from the University of Minnesota. She's a candidate of philological science from the Kazakh National University, and she has a PhD from King's College London. Her research interests focus on language socialization, language and education policy, and language ideology. Her publications include papers in the Journal of Social Linguistics, the International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, World Englishes, and others.
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And the presentation I'm going to do, it's slightly different from what I wrote in my abstract several weeks ago. Since then, the paper developed a bit, and I had time to think about it. What you see on the first slide, I really love this pictogram, because it's a great illustration how you can adapt, appropriate, and change narratives. Okay, so this is a Bronze Age picture. It used to be a deer. You can see the horns. Okay. Okay. The previous era. Then in the following era, people started appreciating horses more than deers. So what they made is they turned the deer into a horse, okay, made longer legs, and it happened like millennia ago, and I thought it's such a nice illustration to what we're trying to talk about here. Okay, probably I don't need to go into details about that. Everyone knows that Kazakh has changed script several times, and the Romanized script were in use from the 1929 to 1940 in Kazakhstan. And you can see some of the illustrations of the old books, which are still available in some archives and libraries. What I want to talk about today is why is Kazakhstan alphabet reform is so slow. Okay, so what is happening, and I'd like to begin with literature review. When do reforms actually succeed? So what makes a script reform successful or effective. And as we know from the literature, and again, because of the lack of time, I'm not going to refer to all the authors. I just go very briefly about the major components. The first thing you see, and when you read this literature, that reforms are more likely to succeed when you have a new alphabet is very well represents the language. Okay? So it's a number of graphemes, principles of representation, of phonetic, phonological, and morphological features. So they're clear to public, so what exactly we're doing. Principles of spelling names and borrowed words, and also semiotic values of indexicality of science. Okay, for example, the first thing Kazakhs did was our Latinization, and we started spelling Kazakh through Q, and this is very important. Okay, has a very, very important symbolic meaning for the Kazakh culture. And then, of course, economy and ergonomics of science, and how well you can use this new script for technological purposes in the modern days. Okay, so once you have a good script, then you're more likely that people will buy into the idea because it makes it easier to communicate. What also we see from literature is that reforms are more likely to succeed when the reform itself is very well aligned with political and social transformation and very well motivated. So you have a great script, but you also say, well, what we're doing is linked to, for example, nation building, modernization, increased literacy rates, liberation or equality. And lots of examples from around the world. For example, Chinese script simplification happened during the Cultural Revolution. The new state came into new political powers, new Chinese culture, new Chinese nation, and that was such a great alignment of the script and the social turn. Or after October Revolution, what happened was Russian spelling reform. Okay, what the Tsarist government was not able to do for many, many years, Bolsheviks did, like basically overnight, because again, there's October Revolution and it coincided, so you can make this change. Okay, and a lot of alphabet changes in the post-Soviet space happened actually when the Soviet Union collapsed and countries became independent. So you had this window of opportunity to do the alphabet change because a major seismic social change was happening. Also, what we see is that reforms are more likely to succeed when it has strong government backing. So it's not just the power of the government to be able to do that, but very consistent backing of the process. It's not just an idea, but the whole process and implementation of that policy. And of course, it cannot happen without support of major stakeholders. Okay, you might think that if you have autocratic regimes, it's easier to do that. Actually, from the example of China, we know no. Okay, even in communist China, some of the second simplification didn't, or Latinization, they wanted to remember, first they did simplification and then they wanted to introduce a Romanized alphabet, didn't happen because the public didn't support it. Okay? Because their own hieroglyphs had too much cultural power and value for the society. So they didn't have the support of major stakeholders, and reform failed. And also, what we know from literature is that these reforms are more likely to succeed when you have probably lower literacy rates, and the writing system doesn't have this cultural importance. When the Soviet Union was changing scripts first from Arabic to Latin, from Latin to Cyrillic, it didn't happen in Georgia and Armenia, because for them, these scripts are too sacred. You cannot do that without serious uproar. Okay, so what we are trying to do, and this paper is co-authored with my colleague Kara Fleming. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to answer very basic questions what Cooper put in this framework. So who is doing the reforms, what is happening, when, why, and how. Okay, and the data that we're using is we're analyzing policy documents. We also did interviews with 3 experts, one Akimat officer who works in the committee for languages. So each Akimat is a local government, and each local government office has a department responsible for language development. Okay. Then there's a member of the committee, working committee, that is developing new orthography for Kazakh. And we also talked with one of the authors of one of the many versions of the new Kazakh alphabet. Okay. And we also did thematic analysis of media. 100 articles in Kazakh and 100 articles in Russian published from 2016 to 2023. Why 100? Because there are zillions of articles out there. So we took basically, when we got to the saturation point, because very, very often articles repeat themselves. So we took the 100 articles throughout the years and did the thematic analysis of them. So when, again, just talking about that, I'll probably can take an hour to say our history of setbacks. Okay, when we start something, then we stop, table, and then start again, table again, and we still don't know whether reform is happening, and when it seems like it is, we don't have the definite date yet. But if you talk about the brief chronology, is that the conversations, the discussion that Kazakh should change the alphabet started in 1991. And this was a very heavy influence of Turkish linguists and Turkish government, because first 3 meetings were organized by Turks, and they happened in Turkey. Okay, so in 1991, International Contemporary Turkic Alphabet Symposium, when they tried to develop a common Turkic alphabet, then a couple of meetings organized by Turkish Ministry of Culture. And after visiting these 3 events, Abduali Haydar, who's then the president of the Institute of Linguistics under the Academy of Sciences, he writes a letter to Nazarbayev, then the president, saying Kazakhstan should change the alphabet. Okay, there's long silence, nothing was happening. Okay, and then finally in 2005, Nazarbayev indicates that probably Latinization should become one of strategic goals, and they create a working group that writes a first concept note and recommendations how the reform should happen, but then everything is tabled in 2007. Okay. Then the issue emerges again in 2012 in Nazarbayev and in the government strategy Kazakhstan 2025. They say yes, Latinization is happening, and by 2025 everything should be in the Latin script. Here we now, we're still talking about it. Okay, and then in 2017, the official announcement was made. The order is issued that Kazakhstan is transferring to Latin alphabet. Okay, they introduced the first version, which was ridiculed, withdrawn. Another version was offered, ridiculed. The third version was offered, ridiculed. And finally, what we have, new Kazakhstan version was offered by the Institute of Linguistics, been discussed, hasn't been approved yet, and we still don't have the orthography. Curiously enough, the very first version, the most hated and most ridiculed, you can't find any reference to that in the state documents anymore. Okay. It's very, so you don't see it. It's not, sorry, it's, of course, should be 19. In 2019, new president comes to power, and what he says is that the historical decision to shift to the Latin alphabet was made about 2 years ago. However, the alphabet still has shortfalls. Linguists should improve it. Okay. And then he reiterates this idea in 2021, 22, 23, and 24, saying that we're not ready yet, we're not there yet, the alphabet is not ready, and we also have to think about financial implications of our decision to shift. The latest one is in 2024, in November, the Turkic countries met again, and Erdogan government and their representatives proudly announced now we have a common Turkic alphabet. We don't know what are the implications for Kazakhstan because we haven't had any official statements. Okay, so talking about the question when. What we see from the policy documents, what we see from the interviews, is that the government has been very, very cautious. Okay, why? Because they are saying that demographically we're not ready. The majority, that the previous speech, as you can see, demographically, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Kazakhs represented minority, demographic minority. A lot of people spoke mainly Russian, including ethnic Kazakhs. So demographically, we were not ready to do that. Okay. Then, of course, there's some document in initial proposal. They try to make calculation how much it's going to cost. Okay, and it seems like it was serious underestimation because they said, "Oh, it's going to be easy." Okay, nothing like. Okay. Even when it's easy, it still comes to millions of dollars. So we still don't know the cost of the enterprise. Okay. What happened over the years? Like we almost had this softening complaints. Are we doing that or we're not doing that? Should we do that or should not do that? And over the years, what you see, the more and more support for the Latinization. Okay, probably it's just a generational shift. The old Soviet people are dying out. The new generation is coming in who are more nationalistic. They're more likely to speak Kazakh. They're more likely to be trilingual. But also what you see, there is a huge shift in discourse. And even people who are against, okay, what we hear from our interviews and anecdotal stories, even those who were against the Latin Romanized script in the beginning, after Crimea and the war in Ukraine, they are more likely to support the idea because they do link it to this decolonization discourse. This is our way to one way to separate from the Russian and Russian culture. In terms of political situation, it seems the question we need to discuss, and we really don't know what evidence to bring. Have we lost the window of opportunity? Yes, we had in 1991, we could do that. And we had another window of opportunity when Nazarbayev left and Tokayev came to power. So major change, and because the alphabet was so bad, it didn't happen. Okay, so have we lost this window of opportunity? So when is the next window when we can do that? Okay, or it's gonna be one of the slow reforms, of course, not as slow as adding a letter U to the Latin alphabet. You know, it took like 1.5 millennia to do that. Yeah, hopefully we're gonna be faster than that. Okay, I don't know. Okay. Then the question is what? So what exactly we're doing? And I think the major question is, are we doing a script reform or it's a language reform? Okay. Initially, the conversation was saying, oh, no, it's very easy. It's just going to be it's technically easy. It's just a, you just press on a button and the computers will going to change all the text from one script to another. Fairly nothing, like we shouldn't worry about that. And what we are concerned about is to create an alphabet that represents the language well. Okay. But after that, more and more we hear in news that actually alphabet change is just a pretense for massive reform of the language, de-Sovietization of the Kazakh language. So you're getting rid of some of the signs that represent Russian sounds that were included in the Kazakh alphabet. They're actually not a native Kazakh sounds. That having these letters change the way we pronounce Kazakh words. So therefore, we have to revive Kazakh. We have to go back to the old ideal Kazakh. That thing, people are still debating. And me seeing some of the discussions. So I think one of the reasons we are so slow is because, not because Russian speakers, like mainly Russian speakers, are against it, is because Kazakh speakers, especially linguists, can't agree with each other. Okay, so they can't agree. For example, one of the earliest quotes from Zenia Bazarbaeva. She works at the Institute of Linguistics, and she's the one who's heavily involved with the alphabet development and the orthography, spelling development. And they're saying if we had fewer signs, it would be easier to read. And that was what President Nazarbayev wanted. He wanted to have alphabet with few letters. Okay, now we know it's not possible. Okay, doesn't represent. Okay, then they came to the idea, no, actually we should keep this Soviet principle that one letter, one sound. That was the Cyrillic alphabet is working on. Okay, but all these linguists, while they're trying to decolonize the language, nativize the alphabet, okay, they still use the Cyrillic alphabet as a starting point. They're not starting from analysis of the language and phonemes and phonological system, but they're starting that, okay, this is the alphabet, how can we represent these letters in the new one? And when you hear these discussions and when these linguists are arguing with each other, the whole discussion is whose canon, what is an ideal Kazakh, okay, which dialect should be the basis for that, because I myself personally have seen linguists screaming at each other that you cannot speak Kazakh. Okay, your Kazakh is wrong. Okay, so not even non-native speakers, native speakers arguing with each other. So that's another thing that is happening behind the walls, very often not public. Okay, so here is one version, 2018 version. This is what they call the New Kazakhstan version, 2021. It's been discussed, but it's not approved yet. Okay, just to make it fun, we also have two other alphabets. Okay, so we have Totejezu, which is used by Kazakhs in China. Okay, and more and more you hear people talking about, well, actually, if we want to revive our culture, if we want to revive something of our own, so maybe we shouldn't bring in the Latin alphabet, we should revive, which is completely our own, is our old Turkic Kazakh runes. Okay, so you have a small group that of course, people who study runic will be upset because it's it's actually Kazakh. It's written Turk here because the Turkic alphabet, the old Turkic alphabet, the runic alphabet was a lot more complex. It's a simplified version, but it has very symbolic function. And even though people not necessarily use these runics, they have a lot of, for imaginary, for cultural stuff, it's used quite frequently. Okay, and the question is who this reform should affect. Okay, often, especially in the previous speeches, Nazarbayev said several times, well, Russian speakers should not be worried, ethnic Russians should not be worried, it's going to concern only Kazakhs, and we'll start introducing in Kazakh medium schools only. Okay, so Russian schools are not going to be affected by that. But then if you travel around Kazakhstan and check our linguistic landscape, then you will see that a lot of Russian words are actually written in Latin alphabet. Okay, so I don't show the pictures here, but it's a very interesting thing what is happening. Okay, but also the question which emerges is that who has the moral right to participate in this discussion of the alphabet? Okay. The quote here says, only native speakers and no one else. Okay, if you don't speak the language, you don't use the language. Why do you care? Don't participate in that discussion. Okay, this is the competence of Kazakhs only, and only power. Okay. The question by whom is the most difficult to answer. Okay, because the previous failed alphabets we've seen, we know the last one is presented by the Institute of Linguistics. The previous three, okay, when you ask around who is the author, no one wants to take the ownership. We don't know where the alphabets come from. Okay? No one, okay. I'm sure the people in the president's office probably know. Be public, it never made who is the author. Okay, but also what happened, we have the discursive change. Initially, the government was sending this message, no, alphabet is going to be a public affair, we're going to have a referendum. At some point, the government said, actually, we're not going to involve public, it's just going to be an administrative decision. Top down, we will decide when and what alphabet is going to be implemented. When you look at the structures, of course, it's a top down. So the president has the ultimate power to decide on that issue. And if you think it's just a political decision, it's not, because often it's also their personal interests and personal preferences. For example, anecdotally, we know that Nazarbayev saying that the alphabet should be as simple as possible, especially the way his name is spelled. So he shouldn't, the letters I used to his name should not have any additional signage. Okay, so therefore that was the basis, and then you can build the alphabet around it. The new president Tokayev, he specifically has specific personal dislike of letter Y, which is used in Kazakh, like in my names, represent sound zhuldız. Okay, because he says in Kazakh there are so many, this letter is so frequently used, and if you write words like tınıştık, okay, it has 3 or 4 Y's, it doesn't look beautiful. Okay, that's why the last alphabet that the Academy of Sciences proposed stalled. So you have this, it's not just political decisions, but also personal preferences. Then you have the office of Prime Minister, because all the state language programs are signed by the Prime Minister. Then we have Minister of Education and Science, and again, even there, we used to be Minister of Education and Science, now it's divided in 2 ministries. One of the ministers, Aymagambetov at the time, I'm not sure why, I guess probably he just got fed up with the issue of alphabet, and he made a decision to transfer that issue to the Ministry of Sports and Culture. Okay, he said it's not, let's them develop because it's a culture, let's them develop the alphabet. Once they do that, then we will take the educational part. Okay, so what the Ministry of Culture does, I think so, because I don't know exactly what happened. They create this new entity with Tilkazana, which is responsible for the development of alphabet and developing all the resources. Okay, and then somehow they decided Institute of Linguistics should also be transferred from under the Ministry of Education to the under Ministry of Culture. Okay, you have a huge public uproar. Okay, and the shift never happened because the linguists were very, very unhappy with that decision. Okay, because of the alphabet change. So Kazana was Academy of Institute of Linguistics, so that the deal with the alphabet never happened. So we still have 2 separate entities. And then the Ministry of Education got divided in 2 different ministries. Ministry of Primary, Secondary Education, which is called Ministry of Enlightenment. How does it translate it in English? And then we have Ministry of Higher Education and Sciences. And under that ministry, you have Committee of Languages, and within that, you have a Republican Orthographic Committee, which is trying to develop the orthography for the language. Okay. And then, of course, you have Institute of Linguistics under the National Academy of Sciences. You have Akimats, which all have departments to do with languages. But then, you also have external actors, Russia and Turkey, which are heavily involved, and you can always, when you make these political decisions, you have to always look at these external actors and their reaction to the situation. So this part, this is just very sketchy, and we're still trying to figure out how these decisions are made. And maybe we even discussed, Oskara, maybe we need to write a methodological paper. So how can you write a paper on language policy if you don't have data and no one wants to give you an interview? Okay, I am local. I know all these people personally. Okay, and I say, can they interview? Can we talk about this? Like, they don't want to talk about it. No one wants to be recorded. Okay, at best you're allowed to take some notes. Okay, so it's a highly politicized matter. And how can you write a paper? Even there, like almost participant observation environment, but nothing is transparent. You have no idea what is happening and why. Okay. In terms of how, we have a number of documents that kind of tell you what's going to happen. And again, here, so you have different, they would create a national, first you had a working group, then they had the national committee, and they have different state programs. And again, they're very, very kind of indicative, like more strategic than actual plans. So we don't really know how it's going to be implemented. And of course, any strategic plan should have a cost. So how much it's going to cost and who's responsible, that is not clear. Okay. So the most detailed document is we have план мероприятий по поэтапному переводу казахского алфавита на латинскую графику until 2025. Okay, so the plan of activities, action plan for transferring the alphabet to Romanized version. Okay, which was signed by Prime Minister in 2018. Of course, the plan has been dismantled or tabled because it didn't. 2025 we don't have it yet. Okay, but in their plan, what they said, we have to develop the alphabet. There should be accompanying corpus planning, so we have to develop orthography and and standardize the language. There's lots of codification activities that were supposed to happen. Then we have to develop methodological support, all the new teaching materials, textbooks, and provide training of teachers. And actually, they started doing that in 2017 and 18 until the new president took power. Okay, and then we have to calculate the budget, how much can it cost. Okay, initially they said that we have to create a special fund for that reform. Didn't happen, and there should be information campaign. Okay, so why we should do that, and that you could actually see in 17, 18, and up to 19, and then it stopped. Okay. While the decisions are not made, okay, there is a huge. You would think that Latin took over because what in literature they call domain saturation. It's everywhere. Okay, from especially in pop culture, younger people, you would have like these T-shirts. Okay, music videos and lots of stuff in landscape are now in Latin script. And I really like the first one because you have all three languages. Okay, so beauty salon, and the name is in English, and then your beauty salon is both in Kazakh and in Russian. Okay, so you have this, like, and people using all sorts of, like, because we don't have the official alphabet, people just do whatever they feel like. Okay. From the more semi-official bodies, what we have is Til Kazana, when the 2017 decree came out that we're gonna shift the alphabet, they created this site which is fully in the Latin script in that previous version, which was officially approved. Okay, and then when they site, you can see that they have the information in Latin Kazakh, in Cyrillic Kazakh, in Russian English, and in Arabic Arabized Kazakh. Okay, and also at the Institute of Linguistics, they started issuing some of their dictionaries and thesauruses, professional, in two scripts. At least you have the models of that on the website. I'm not sure they actually physically printed anything. When it comes to question why this is our media analysis, so what we did a thematic analysis of what are the major arguments you would be reiterated in mass media. Immediately you can see the difference between Kazakh and Russian medium. The Kazakhs are more likely to support and much more likely to discuss. And Russian media, probably they have something to say, but they are a lot more cautious. Okay, they'd rather not to talk about it unless they asked to do that. And if you can see, there are so many reasons why people think, or journalists think, or the government think that we have to shift the alphabet. This is Kazakh national identities, this is purification of Kazakh, integration of modernization, decolonization, derussification, suitability, pragmatic reasons, and political reasons. There's so many reasons, and this is not very clear what exactly and why we're doing. Okay, and as Akimat person told me, well, you know what, if you read those newspapers, I said, what in newspapers they give these reasons. He said, you know what, all this modernization crap is for foreigners. Okay, actually, okay, we are just doing purification of Kazakh. Okay, so this was just for everyone else, and that was. And then lately, this idea, no, actually, it's not an apolitical decision, but political decision, and it's not about the script, it's about deeper language reforms. That idea slowly become more dominant in media, because before, initially, you wouldn't see that in any conversations. Okay, but we still would see is that there is lack of ideological clarification. They clearly shift from not a political decision. What the government said, no, it's not a political. It's a very technical decision. Okay, now they say no, it's a political decision. Okay, and as Dubélé say is that it's such a powerful tool, and the government cannot make mistakes. Okay, and really like this quote, what they're saying is that successful alphabet reforms can provide a stronger guarantee of social cohesion and domestic legitimacy, while some procedural mistakes in change in writing script can lead to economic losses and outward migration. Alphabet changes often reflect the pragmatic calculation and interest of the ruling elite. So if you do it well, it helps you. If you do it wrong, it can be seriously question your legitimacy as a government. So therefore, probably it's one of the reasons we're so cautious in our move way to this shift. Okay, so just to summarize, why is it so slow? That our analysis shows is that we still have huge disagreements about the ideal alphabet and orthography. So we still don't know what is a better representation of Kazakh phonetics and phonology, and what is best spelling for our. So we have huge variation on that. Okay, there is lack of ideological clarification. We don't know why we're doing that, or maybe some people know but they're not telling the public, or public does not work, and because the society is so fragmented, different groups want to hear different things. Okay, so you don't have this unified idea why we're doing that. There is lack of government backing because we had so many with tabled and sidetracked. Okay, now the new goal is from the target shifted from 2025 to 2031. Okay. But it's there in documents. We don't know what's going to happen. There is a public support as a landscape, linguistic landscape data shows, but it's used mainly for symbolic purposes. Actual serious texts, they're not produced in this new script. And the question of timing, as I said earlier, have we missed the window of opportunity? And when is the next window of opportunity going to open for that? Then, of course, the actors, there are too many of them, very different, doing different things, having different interests, and not very clear, and the whole process is not very transparent. So who's making decisions? Okay, why these decisions are made? Okay, and because when you do this sort of analysis in the Western countries, you have clear political affiliations of newspapers. In Kazakhstan, that's not the story. You do have a position, very limited. Okay, and then it's such top-down organization. Even journalists get calls, and editors are called and told not to publish something. Like, again, you don't see it, but it's a lot of like kind of anecdotal evidence you hear from conversations with journalists. And of course, there are pragmatic reasons. financial and other costs. Financial, we don't know how much the reform is going to cost. There is still no number put on that. Do we have these resources at the moment or not? And of course, other costs, because there's still fear that demographically Kazakhstan is still weak. Okay, we've just got to 20 million. It took us forever to get from 16 to 20 to add this 4 million, 30 years. So, and if people continue living, and if they cite language and alphabet, one of the reasons. So, of course, for population management purposes, probably it's not the best decision. Okay. And I've done with my presentation what I wanted to say. I know you representatives of various institutions. So what we're trying to do is that sorry, a bit of advertisement. On May, we're going to have a first workshop on documenting and describing Turkic languages. So I can send that poster to you, and it's going to be followed by International Turkic Languages Summer School, which we offer in partnership with Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies of Harvard University, and we're going to offer beginner Kazakh, Chagatai, and Uyghur languages. Okay, okay, thank you. And this is the huge debate. We still don't know how to spell Rakhmet. Okay, there are some saying Rahmet, and some don't know you have to do it from Rakhmet. And there's if you check our Instagram or TikTok, there's and of course there's also Latinized version of that. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh yeah, what is Akimet, and is the fact that Ak is in that significant?
No. Akim is Hakim. It's a head. Yeah. So Akimat is a local government.
Okay, thank you.
So sorry.
No worries. But would Ak be related to this concept of purity at all?
No. I think it's Hakim.
Okay. Okay.
It's Arabic. Yeah. Okay. We have lots of Arabic words.
Just a short question. When you were talking to the decision makers, did this come up when they look into like the case of Uzbekistan? The lessons learned from there.
That's the best example if you want to say the reform is going to fail, you shouldn't do that. So the poster case, like every time you have a critique in media, the newspaper, they usually refer to Uzbekistan case.
Okay. Is it shared then by the decision makers as well? Like the
Yeah. Okay.
Quick one? Okay. You mentioned dialects, right? And it's usually held that Kazakh language has comparatively little, if hardly any dialect difference. I would usually agree to that. But has there been a large debate? Because in any other context, you usually have also to find out which dialect actually to build the literary script on. In Uzbekistan, that is a big issue because it has to do with regional animosities. But in Kazakhstan, I haven't heard that so far.
Yeah, so you don't have much research on dialects. Okay, so and the dialect differences, of course, are very, very minimal. Okay, but still, the few meetings I participated, I was invited to listen. Kazakh linguists, they argue with each other how to pronounce certain words, and they couldn't agree with each other. Okay, and how to spell, because some people are saying that, for example, the word I don't know, like sir, which is a cow. Yeah, if you write down like how some people pronounce it, the word becomes very long. Sir, yeah, and so people disagree on how to pronounce e, like b. Okay, and so yeah, so some it's not huge, but there are disagreements, and very often I think that's a matter of the ideal canon they have in their heads. Like in the past it was like that. Now we speak in Ron, okay, and we're gonna revive that whatever was in the past, and we don't know what the past ideal was. Okay, it's very, very ideological. Okay, so I went over time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Alex Warburton.
Yes.
Who's a PhD candidate in social anthropology at Harvard University, who specializes in post-Soviet language politics. His dissertation examines the intersection of language ideology, social change, and developmentalist aspirations in urban Kazakhstan.
Thank you.
Getting ready, I'd like to thank Frank and the organizers and facilitators for having me. So I'd like to start with a disclaimer. I'm an anthropologist, and we tend to have a unwritten norm that we tend to read our papers, and for people from other disciplines that might come as a disappointment. So I just wanted to let you know, I did try to make it much more orally friendly, but yes. So, one day in early October 2022, I'm sitting in a cafe in the center of Almaty, Kazakhstan's largest city, sipping hot tea with some members of Kazakhsha Jaz, which means right in Kazakh, as an imperative. A volunteer-run organization whose self-professed goal is to defend the rights of Kazakh-speaking consumers. Kuat, a young man in his late 20s, a core member and moderator of their Telegram chat, has brought a stack of petitions called Narazılık Khat, or letters of complaint or objection, for the gathered members to sign under the section entitled Consumer Signatures. These formal letters to medium and large companies that operate in Kazakhstan are written in careful legalese. Also, because this is a conference about script, I'd like to make my own allegiances clear, which I use the Turkish convention of the dotless I to represent the sound. I do agree with Tokayev that many Y's is aesthetically unpleasing, but also that's a convention that comes purely from Russian, and so I think in the interest of decolonization, we should probably think of alternative ways to do that. And that's on record now, I guess. So on the top of the stack is a letter to Halyk Bank, the largest bank in Kazakhstan. It says, the Halyk Home Bank application does not send SMS, push messages, or notifications in Kazakh. The Kazakh section of the application does not fully provide information about the services and activities provided by the bank in Kazakh. In addition, advertising materials about bank services and related visual information are often not in Kazakh. We inform you that these facts violate our rights as consumers. We protest against the failure to fulfill the obligations specified in Article 21 of the Law on Languages in the Republic of Kazakhstan and Article 10, Paragraph 1, and Article 25, Paragraph 3 of the Law of the Republic of Kazakhstan on protection of consumer rights. End quote. It asks the chairman of the board to rectify the situation and ends by gently threatening that if our request is not fulfilled, we remind you that we have the right to appeal to the court in accordance with paragraph 3 of Article 42.4 of the Law on Protection of Consumer Rights. And you can see the signatures at the bottom. Though Kazakhstani language laws regulate the presence of Kazakh in companies' consumer-facing written materials, in practice, these laws have often been ignored. Walking through Almaty or browsing businesses' social media pages reveal signs, text, and posts that are frequently in Russian only, partially translated into Kazakh, or that have the Russian information prioritized. Kazakhsha Jaz identifies the cause of this issue as twofold. The state does not adequately enforce language laws, and businesses perceive low demand for Kazakh language information. This leaves businesses with little incentive to comply. To address this gap, Kazakhsha Jaz relies both on legal pathways, focusing on pushing to provide online information in Kazakh, and educating consumers how to drive demand for such content. Lacking the resources or means to influence state bodies directly, Kazakhsha Jaz instead targets the enforcement gap between legislation and business behavior. With no budget and running on what they call the pure enthusiasm of volunteers, Kazakhsha Jaz expects that, like a pyramid, by pressuring large companies to follow language laws and increasing the demand for them to do so, smaller businesses will emulate them to remain competitive and grow. This strategy has proven effective. Kazakhsha Jaz has successfully pushed major international and domestic companies operating in Kazakhstan to provide information in Kazakh online. Their success highlights how targeted advocacy can drive social change by leveraging market dynamics and aligning legal compliance with business logics. Kazakhsha Jaz primarily makes use of two laws, which you heard in the Narazılık Khat, on the protection of consumer rights and on languages in the Republic of Kazakhstan. Under Articles 24 and 25.3 of the Consumer Rights Law, companies must provide information about their goods, services, and the seller in both Kazakh and Russian on the internet. Similarly, Article 21 of the 2022 version of the On Language Law requires visual information, including advertisements, price lists, menus, and signs, to be displayed in Kazakh and, quote, if necessary, end quote, in Russian or other languages. As a result, while both languages are legally required in some contexts, Kazakh is mandatory in all consumer-facing situations, such as online content and signage. Despite these legal requirements, Russian remains dominant in practice on websites and social media and in urban centers like Almaty that have a history of Russian language dominance. In cities and on the internet, it is rare to find consumer-facing materials exclusively in Kazakh, though the reverse is common. Kazakh was founded in 2020 when the problem of obtaining services in Kazakh on the internet became acute during quarantine. People were using social networks and online services more often, and they noticed many large companies operating in Kazakhstan maintain their pages on social networks only in Russian. A founder, Zhalgas, calls it the beginning of an awareness of discrimination, that he realized, quote, it was a restriction on my right to information. However, he says at the beginning he thought, and many people said, it was a pie-in-the-sky idea. But we created one chat, one group, and now the rules and requirements of Kazakh have become public demands, he says, as it's slowly beginning to change. Kazakh initially focused on flooding the social media platforms of targeted companies with comments from individuals politely requesting information in Kazakh, in a strategy they called terbeu, which literally means to rock or to sway. Terbeu operates under the understanding that it is difficult for a company to ignore a request when many customers and potential customers ask for it. It is said to work under the pressure of the social network by showing that there is consumer demand for Kazakh. To start a terbeu action, Kazakh publishes a post on their chat and Instagram page announcing the target company with a link to its social media and models how to write appropriate social media comments. This comes with a reminder that it is important not to insult or argue, just calmly and politely ask for information in Kazakh. While terbeu is still a main technique of action for Kazakh, as the group matured, they began employing legal mechanisms and formal requests as a follow-up to terbeu actions that aren't immediately heeded. Now they often use these legal pathways by themselves, skipping terbeu. This is because, according to Quad, company social media managers have learned to erase the first messages in a terbeu action to prevent a social media pileup, or the business just posts an apology and moves on, not having changed materially. In Kazakhstan's increasingly technocratic governance, individuals as citizens can submit a complaint through EOTNISH, a site through which submissions and appeals to government agencies can be made. Complaints about particular companies should be sent, according to Kazakh to the Consumer Rights Protection Committee of the jurisdiction in which the company's office is located. Companies themselves, however, do not read submissions to EOTNISH, and it's unclear if the state body will follow up on the request anyway. So Kazakh suggests that the petitioner should also send a letter of protest or narazalakat to the company itself. Theoretically, even a company's first offense under Kazakhstani language laws can result in a civil case, or azamatik is, with repeated violations escalating to supervision by the Akimat city administration or inspection by state bodies. Such scrutiny is undesirable for businesses operating in Kazakhstan's non-transparent judicial and administration system. As Quad explains, the government has numerous tools to pressure businesses, including audits, taxes, contract delays, and administrative pressure. Kazakh leverages this environment by getting the state involved. According to Quad, Kazakh quote, pits business against government, end quote, using the threat of legal enforcement to compel compliance. Businesses tend to respond quickly after receiving a formal letter with a lot of words, he says, as the risk of state involvement outweighs the rarely enforced modest fines. For instance,
In the first 10 months of 2022, only 5 violations were reported, with 1 fine issued for 38,288 tenge, which is about $85. So the prospect of a court case or investigation by the prosecutor's office is a significant deterrent, as no business wants to court state scrutiny. So Kazakh-Shijaz's effectiveness lies in exploiting Kazakhstan's formal commitment to the rule of law, as well as the informal institutional realities that often circumvent it. Kazakh-Shijaz, according to the administrators themselves, is primarily comprised of urban youth. Their average member is a, quote, free-thinking, persistent, literate, cultured city dweller, ready to bring positive changes to their environment, end quote. Kuat says they are mostly people under 35. Politeness and persistence are core tenets of Kazakh-Shijaz's approach to language activism. Members emphasize acting in a cultured manner, or madaniyat turde, which is a calque of the Russian kulturny, which comes from the Soviet idea of kulturnost, which was a state-endorsed concept of culturedness and civilization advancement that emphasized respectability and moral personhood. It encompassed everything from commodity consumption to a desire for self-improvement and an appreciation of high art and literature. In Kazakh-Shijaz's case, cultured behavior primarily refers to what we might call politeness, as they believe that courteous and rational requests are more effective in fostering positive responses from businesses. Jalgas explains, if one asks aggressively, then the response will be negative and therefore the action less effective. This strategy reflects a deliberate rejection of more confrontational tactics used by some Kazakh language activists. A particularly visible genre of ad hoc Kazakh language activism, often circulated on social media, involves individuals filming ambush-style interactions in which they demand service in Kazakh and, when denied, publicly berate the often non-Kazakh shopkeeper or employee unable or unwilling to speak in Kazakh. For example, in August 2021, the author of the YouTube channel Til Maydana, Kuat Akhmetov, had a criminal case opened against him for inciting ethnic hatred under Article 174 of the Criminal Code as a result of creating a platform for and circulating such videos. The deputy head of the presidential administration, Dauran Abayev, called the videos cave nationalism, which is a common phrase evoking the progression from primitiveness to civilization and reflecting the enduring emphasis on culturedness. Jalgas warns, if we don't want our entire society to turn into Akhmetov, then the demand and request should be in a very polite form. However, even polite forms of request get pushback. Simply asking for service in Kazakh in areas where Russian predominates has often been seen as a nationalist move that challenges the multi-ethnic character of Kazakhstan, in which Russian is often called the language of interethnic communication. In this logic, requesting service in Kazakh, especially when done so with an ethnically non-Kazakh service worker, is seen to be an infringement or ущемление on the rights of Russian speakers. This reflects a broader concern that promoting Kazakh might come at the expense of Russian speakers' comfort and access in a type of zero-sum logic. Jalgas says at first that they were called chauvinists by critics and accused of acting aggressively even though they were, quote, only demanding our rights as according to law. He says that this is because our society does not live by law, it lives by an understanding. There's an idea that if you speak Kazakh, you are disturbing the peace, and this perception is still assumed to be above the law. It's not that speaking Kazakh in itself is considered a nationalist provocation. Rather, there are certain spaces and genres of interaction in Kazakhstan, and especially in a Russian-dominant city like Almaty, where Russian has long been the de facto language. It's the use of Kazakh in these spaces in certain interactional genres, for instance in urban service interactions, and with certain participants, especially non-Kazakhs, that can be marked as a nationalist provocation. In post-Soviet public discourse, nationalism can still carry a negative valence, especially to predominantly Russian speakers. Despite the Soviet history of building national cultures and institutionalizing ethnicity, correct nationalist feelings were to be expressed within a broader framework of harmonious multi-ethnic internationalism, often called the friendship of the peoples. This meant that negative forms of nationalism included any expression that conveyed insufficient admiration for Russia, or that came at the expense of Russian, which, as the Soviet lingua franca, was the medium through which the friendship of the peoples was expressed. You can see by this poster. This moral loading is especially heightened in a multi-ethnic state like Kazakhstan, where fostering harmony among diverse ethnic groups is an important state virtue, and for which fear of ethnic fraction looms large. For this reason, Kazakh-Shujaz does the work of anticipatory disavowal, making sure to clarify in public interviews that, quote, we do not deny the role of Russian, we just ask for Kazakh too, end quote, and that they, quote, do not infringe on the Russian language, end quote. Kazakh-Shujaz's position is expressly formulated in response to these stereotypes of nationalist language activists. Their self-fashioning rests on an opposition between emotional aggressivity of other activists versus their own cultured, goal-oriented behavior. Members of Kazakh-Shujaz often refer to the former as crying or zhilao about language and oppose it to taking action. If something is wrong, Quat says, one shouldn't go on Facebook or Instagram and write, "This is bad, my poor Kazakh language," but instead write directly to the owners of the business and the interested parties. He points out that it's the same effort on your part, just as you would write on social media to your followers. You write to the business, but the second way gets results. Rather than acting of what they call personal motive, it's acting out of what they call the perspective of the law. Jalgas says that it's more important to insist or demand when it comes to Kazakh rather than cry about it. And this decorum is important. The Kazakh-Shujaz chat is policed for unconstructive outbursts or lamentations. When someone is repeating negative comments, the admin gives a warning, points out the rules of neutrality and etiquette, and even reposts excerpts from the law to help the offender redirect the complaint into productive, goal-oriented activity. This scalar move or upscaling ideologically elevates Kazakh-Shujaz's work from the realm of individual emotional grievance or individual nationalist feelings to logical action, logical collective action, because law here functions as a rational source of authority outside the self, and because these actions are redirected within the collective framework of Kazakh-Shujaz as a movement. Kazakh-Shujaz seeks to help Kazakh speakers see themselves not just as consumers with legal rights, but as empowered customers in a market system who can influence business through demand. In doing so, Kazakh-Shujaz emphasizes the impact of everyday choices in a reflexive economic system where actions are monitored and quantified by businesses. For example, Jalgas highlights how 95% of ATM users of the popular Kaspi Bank banked in Russian, even if they primarily spoke Kazakh at home. Businesses then point to statistics like this as evidence of a lack of demand for Kazakh services. Kazakh-Shujaz argues that breaking these entrenched patterns requires deliberate effort and a shift in consciousness on the part of the consumer. By consistently choosing Kazakh at ATMs, public service centers, or call centers, individuals signal demand and disrupt the feedback loops businesses use to justify stasis. This commitment to an internal principle, or ishki princip, that is, choosing Kazakh in all interactions, even when uncomfortable, becomes a powerful tool for normalizing the language. Through this framework, Kazakh-Shujaz imbues everyday consumer acts with moral and political significance. This is supposed to be blank. By reframing personal consumption choice, I just didn't want you staring at an ATM for like 2 minutes. By reframing personal consumption choices as acts of principle, Kazakh-Shujaz enjoins Kazakh speakers to see their individual behaviors as integral to challenging bureaucratic inertia and fostering structural change. Kazakh-Shujaz's emphasis on empowering Kazakh speakers as market actors represents a form of civic engagement that goes beyond traditional notions of rights as entitlements granted by the state. While the Narazılıkhat complaint letter genre relies on a liberal understanding of individual rights, framing the consumer as a rights-bearing citizen, this is only one aspect of Kazakh-Shujaz's approach. The case of Terbeu illustrates a broader strategy, which is that of encouraging Kazakh speakers to see themselves not only as subjects of the market, but also as active agents capable of shaping it. Jalgas likens Kazakh-speaking consumers to a giant sleeping whale, whose untapped potential to influence business through demand and marketing statistics holds great promise. We do not yet know its potential, he says of the whale. We cannot calculate how far it can develop or imagine our own capabilities. By reframing individual consumer choices as moral acts within a broader collective movement, Kazakh again draws on the legacy of kulturnost. The Soviet culturedness doctrine linked consumption to respectability. Practices like dressing appropriately, behaving properly in public, or reading the right literature were not just reflections of one's values in education, but also ways to embody the role of the modern Soviet citizen and thereby contribute to a shared vision of socialist progress. By encouraging individuals to act strategically and with principle, Kazakh bridges the personal and the collective, adapting Soviet notions of culturedness and ideals of self-discipline and respectability to a world in which participation in the market is central to dignity and progress. While being cultured in the Soviet Union signaled one's role in advancing socialist modernity, in the post-Soviet era, culturedness has evolved into a marker of middle-class respectability and global cosmopolitanism, here tied to the project of building a modern Kazakh-speaking nation. Kazakh emphasis on culturedness and the portrayal of Kazakh speakers as modern, cultured, and cosmopolitan strategically repositions the Kazakh language as central to Kazakhstan's contemporary identity. A 2023 public service ad Kazakh promulgated through a partnership with the government-funded Til Kazina Institute exemplifies this vision. And here's some stills from the video. It shows two stylish young people on their way to a date, confidently using navigation apps, ATMs, and asking for the menu in a white tablecloth restaurant in downtown Almaty, all in Kazakh. This imagery directly counters stereotypes that Kazakh speakers are rural, unsophisticated, or economically marginal. By presenting Kazakh speakers as middle-class, tech-savvy consumers, Kazakh dismantles the myth, as Zhalgas notes, that Kazakh speakers have low purchasing power. Instead, they are depicted as desirable participants in a modern tech-enabled economy. Businesses are key players in the implementation of language policy, as they are legally required to provide services and materials in Kazakh. Though Kazakh uses legal mechanisms to push for compliance, they also recognize that businesses ultimately make decisions based on perceived demand for Kazakh language services in order to justify the effort and expense of translation. Kazakh activism, framed around culturedness and principled consumption, directly targets these market dynamics. By encouraging Kazakh speakers to make conscious choices that create demand for Kazakh and demonstrate that they are a desirable market demographic, that is, they're tech-savvy, rational, and not aggressive or capricious, Kazakh shows businesses that addressing the needs of Kazakh speakers can fulfill not just a legal requirement, but also present an economically beneficial opportunity or market segment. And more broadly, by working within the framework of language and consumer rights and adhering to a polite, reasonable advocacy, while avoiding targeting the individuals and small companies that are often the subject of viral language activism videos, Kazakh also distanced itself from the stereotype of the aggressive and chauvinistic Kazakh language speaker. This makes their activism, and more broadly, the mere act of requesting service in Kazakh, legible and acceptable within Kazakhstan's broader socio-political context. What makes Kazakh work particularly compelling is its focus on the marketplace as a site of linguistic and cultural negotiation. In the post-Soviet space, as we've seen, state-led language policies have been central to nation-building efforts, serving as a means of asserting cultural sovereignty and distancing successor states from Soviet legacies and Russian influence. While Kazakhstan's language reforms, such as the elevation of Kazakh and a transition to a Latin-based script, reflect these broader goals, top-down policies like these often remain symbolic or poorly implemented without grassroots support and enforcement mechanisms, especially as they bump up against the realities of a market-driven economy. Kazakh therefore turns abstract state objectives into tangible changes by leveraging both consumer and language laws and market dynamics to encourage businesses and consumers to write in Kazakh. In a context with limited avenues of political engagement to influence language policy, this illustrates how the market can serve as an alternate arena of contestation. whose dynamics can be harnessed by consumers as citizens to drive collective linguistic and social transformation. Thank you.
Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. My question, well, I was struck by the fact that Kazakhstan Jazz has their logo in Latin letters, but their communication is in Cyrillic. So, you know, I thought maybe using Cyrillic is, my question is using Cyrillic a sign of culturedness and politeness, as if, you know, we are not maximalists. We could be maximalists because see our logos in Latin, but because we want to be sort of soft and mellow and meet halfway, we're actually going for Cyrillic, and, you know, this is a way to sort of, it sends a message, and the message is implicit in the script they use, potentially. If so, am I right in my interpretation, or am I reading too much in this specific communication?
You could be right. I mean, it's a great interpretation that I think is part of it. I will say, actually with Lina's talk too, she had some screenshots from a group called Kazakh Grammar.
Right.
Kazakh Grammar, Kazakhstan Jazz, there's like a couple more, are all sort of similar. I mean, they're actually people who know each other. They repost from each other a lot. Kazakh Grammar has its own Latinization script that they've come up with that is pretty significantly different from the official scripts. They don't use the Y, for instance. So I think were they to do that, they would need to use, they would be inclined to use Kazakh Grammar script, which is contentious. And I think in this case, it might also just be a more pragmatic issue of reaching as many people as they want. I mean, they have this evangelical idea of how to educate people of their rights as consumers. So I think in this case, it probably is more a more practical issue than I think an ideological one. But I'm going to think about it, so thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering if, so this is an example where Kazakhstan Jazz was actually involved in some kind of cooperation. Do you know of other cases where they were consulted for, like before rolling out something in Kazakh, or involved in developing, like how known they are among like service providers?
Amongst, I mean, service providers, they are, because they've sent all these letters and followed up. They're pretty dogged about it, and they do have like many successes that are directly traceable. For like they had, they got a Kazakh language Telegram interface, and Spotify and these things like that that come through their direct participation. I don't think that they have. I don't think that they're consulted by any means. I will. At one of the Kazakhstan Jazz meetings, a representative from the Akimat's onomastics committee came and talked to us in a very frank, called it zhigater, like boys, you know, and like there was this very frank, and he was like he's like, you can't repeat this, you can't repeat this. So there's this very like friendly thing, but I don't think that there's any kind of formal cooperation. I think that that's both. Also, there is a tendency to be contain implicit and sometimes explicit criticism of the way that language policy is managed as well.
Yeah. One more.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting. And one thing I noticed, I think it was the first slide, was this document. I don't know if it was in the document or the presentation slide that you mentioned the Turkic italic I, right? Okay. I'm curious how, if there is a usage of or preference for that italic I over the Y, how that is typed by users in Kazakhstan. Is it like, is there a computer keyboard input method, or is it usually used in a mobile platform?
First of all, I wouldn't really say that there's preference or users of this besides Kazakh Grammar in this like very rarefied sphere of young educated people who care about language issues. So I don't think that I wouldn't say that anyone else is really doing this yet. But you can do it on a Turkish keyboard, and that's one of the Kazakh grammar's alphabet. I'm pretty sure it can all be done on a Turkish keyboard.
I'm going to download it on iOS and play with it right now.
Yeah, you do like Control-I or something like that. And
Or maybe like a long press.
People in Kazakhstan are used to also Turkish, trying to sing Turkish,
Yeah.
hearing Turkish, so there's also familiarity to it.
Yes. The weird thing, though, too, is actually, I totally forgot about this as well, but the official version does contain this glyph of a dotless I. However, they use it for I and not So presumably people using the official Latinization script, if they're able to produce the I as the dotless I, would also be able to produce the as the back vowel. So, yeah.
But the problem is you have two letters, but you have three different sounds. Yeah. So one is soft, one is back, and then we'll have So, and you have only one letter. Okay. One letter. The English one was a dot on the top. The Turkish doesn't have dot. Okay. So it's, some people argue it's very difficult to distinguish. And then you have sound. So and the same with u. We have different u's, three different u's, and only one letter. So how do we represent three different u sounds?
But that is one criticism.
That's a major disagreement. Yeah.
That this dotless I in the official version is being used for actually a front vowel, where the Turkish version it's the opposite of a back vowel. So it completely rewrites what phoneme it represents. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Peter Finker, who is a professor of social anthropology at the University of Zurich. He specialized in economic anthropology with a focus on the ongoing transformation processes in post-socialist Central and Inner Asia, where he has conducted extensive fieldwork since the early 1990s. He is the editor of 2 book series on economic and social transformation in Central and Inner Asia at Routledge, and Culture and Society in Eurasia at Berghahn. His latest publication is the book Kazakh Pastoralist in Western Mongolia, Institutional Change, Economic Diversification, and Social Stratification, that came out with Routledge in 2023.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me and all the other ones. That's chilling. I'd like to begin with one disclaimer, and have a few more in a minute. That is, like Jules, also the paper that I prepared now is rather different from the abstract I sent, but I didn't bother to change the title, so it may actually be a mismatch to what I'm talking about. And I will be quick. We are a bit over time, and a lot of things have already been said, so I don't have to repeat things. Just some general comments. What I thought I might talk about. One is that we already heard that the transition is slow, to say the least, if not stuck in a way. And we also heard about a number of reasons for that, financial ones, etc. My only guess is that there are other reasons behind that as well, which is geopolitics, right? It is kind of a volatile environment in which for Kazakhstan more than for any of the other Eurasian states, and a switch to Latin would certainly not be to the amusement of the government in Moscow. So we can only imagine if that is in the back of some politicians. Another reason to say we don't have to hurry with that, right, at this point. That's what I would get. That's kind of interesting, and only because it is in contradiction to what Frank would write in the proposal for the conference, if the war on Ukraine has actually accelerated getting away from that. I think for the case of Kazakhstan, it certainly has not. It may have had the opposite effect for the time being, not among, as we heard, people on the ground. In spite of being stuck, there is a parallel existence, and Alex has nicely talked about that in particular niches, but also in more broader public to a certain extent. So there's a parallel existence of the Latin script already, and there's mutual influences where we already also heard of writing and speaking or pronouncing and the way that language is influenced by just the idea or the attempts to do that. And thirdly, there is overlapping processes of Russification and Kazakization that go on, of course, for decades. I mean, that's nothing new, but there's new elements to it, as it seems to me. And finally, what I guess I will try to, if we should end up writing papers on this, what would be my focus, would to look at it from a different perspective, namely as a matter of institutional change. A language as such is an institution. Any type of grammar is an institution. At least institutionalists like myself would often use language as a model to try to explain other people how social institutions work. But we rarely make that connection in actually looking at language, and even more so maybe alphabets, as a clear social institution, with a man-made or human-made system of regulations of how to do things, what happens if you don't, who is deciding on that, and how institutional changes or ruptures go on. Okay, positionality, I don't like the word very much, but it kind of reflects what I should have said disclaimers here, maybe. I think it's a much nicer and modest, more humble word. I'm an anthropologist as well, and not even an anthropologist particularly. I have worked on identity quite a bit, but not in that context. An economic anthropologist, as Frank has said. I also have a background in Turkology, many years, if not decades ago. But as we all know, as anthropologists, we're not, our concern is not to know languages by heart or perfect or grammatically correct, but we use them in everyday life. But what I've done and what I guess is my expertise, if there is any in this group of people, is to be an outside observer for the last 30 years, since the early 90s when I started to visit Kazakh areas and see how actually things have changed, how pronunciations have changed, how usage of languages has changed, how ideas about languages obviously also have changed. My interest in that began when the book that Frank was saying, which came out last year, on Kazakhs in Mongolia, when I was thinking about what kind of a transliteration should I use? Because there isn't, and Cyrillic, right? That's right. Not use a translator. Most people don't use transliterations anymore, it seems to me. But as being trained as a Turkologist, I thought, well, to start with the ethnonym. How do you write Kazakh? Why would you write a Russified version of an ethnonym for people who have never been part of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire as such, right? Those in Mongolia. I could use the Mongolian word how these are called, but that would make a switch around. There would be KH in the beginning and K in the end, because in Mongolian, Kazakhs are called Khazak, which is a pronunciation that Kazakhs don't really like very much, as far as I know.
They don't call them that.
No, not anymore. It's written. That's in the.
Yeah, that's what they write in the legal.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's in the official dictionary, in fact. So how do you deal with the transliteration that is actually transliteration and for Kazakh of different provinces? But then my main really interest is as an economic anthropologist in process of institutional change and rupture. What does it make? What kind of path dependencies do you have that develop out there? What's the role of relative bargaining power of different actors in that game, etc. Now, this is very, very explorative, but this is what I would like to play out in a potential paper then. So the background is, I don't have to repeat that very much, but there has been a chain of alphabetic shifts. We have heard about that from Arabic via Latin to Cyrillic, back to Latin or not, and who was it? Possibly to the runic script back again, which I had to learn as an undergraduate, but I've forgotten everything of that. Apart from the script, the language issue, when I started to visit Kazakhstan in the early mid-90s, people in Almaty, there was no Kazakh spoken in Almaty on the streets anywhere. I mean, not a word. And the funny thing is that people would say, even Kazakhs in Russia speak better Kazakhs than us, right? I don't know if that was true. I never went there, but I could imagine to some degree it was true because it has a different role in there, and it's a different social strata, obviously, that people belong to. Since then, some different streams of Kazakhization have been going on demographically, as we know, in particular, and that is where I'm close to with the invitation for the global diasporas to come back to Kazakhstan, and that was quite successful. I mean, the number of Kazakhs jumped from 40 to 70%, roughly speaking. Today, 10% of all Kazakhs in Kazakhstan are members of the Khandas category. That is, they came from abroad or their parents came from abroad. Culturally, politically, etc. And then there is a growing dominance in different parts of Kazakhstan, but certainly in the southeastern parts that I know best, and in the southern parts. And I think particularly what has changed is the implicitness, the clarity. I mean, back in the 90s, it was clear that in public you speak Russian, and whenever you meet, that has disappeared. That idea has disappeared. I would think that the diasporas, the Oram and the Khandas, had an important part in their playing because they obviously don't speak Russian or very badly only. Okay. The aims we have mentioned about, I don't feel the most qualified person to say which of these aims are, in fact, play out to what degree. I thought it was funny to hear that Akimyat members say we don't give a shit on modernity. This is all about. I thought, but I can't believe that this is actually true, because the question of technology and how do you deal with the internet and how do you deal with the different keyboards, and Kazakh Cyrillic with 42 characters is quite a challenge for writing. Would there be a possibility to reduce the number, irrespective of if you move to Latin, or if you could also, we just talked about with Alex, of course you could live without the Q or the K in Kazakh. You don't really need it by any means, because Kyrgyz has exactly the same differentiation of sounds without having different letters for that. Because they don't interfere with each other. They don't make it possible to mix up words, because they stand for themselves. Today, clearly it is a sign of decolonization, and then the question is, anyway, we learned that we're not supposed to have a saying in this because we're not Kazakhs. What do you do when you use Q, right? It is a political statement. Obviously, if you don't, it is a political statement as well, and how do you deal with that? But it is used as a sign of decolonization, of course, by some groups that Alex would present, of gaining autonomy from Russia, and that makes it, in the specific context of Kazakhstan, such a delicate and disputed, contested area. And as we also heard, yes, you may use it, and I'm in line with the president in this way, it is more than a mechanics shift. I think that's clear. I think that's it's trivial, but it's actually a smart move to mention that, because it could be, at least this is another window of opportunity to use that. And you could think of, already mentioned, that there have been, and I'm not a linguist who could say that, but I think it is relatively clear to establish that when the different Cyrillic scripts were created in the 1940s, that you used marginal differences to distinguish cognate languages in a way that makes it much easier to understand a Kyrgyz in speaking than in writing, or a Karakalpak, or whatever for that matter. An alphabetic change, a coordinated alphabetic change, of course, could make that, if you want to. You don't have to, but if you want to, could change that into, or reverse this situation. So state of things, yes, we heard about that. There is an internal dispute on the advantages and the costs that was there from the beginning. That is a legitimate discourse, obviously. There has been a series of different versions, including the last one of the Common Turkic Alphabet, and I'm really curious to learn more how that is conceptualized. And it is practically frozen, let's put it like that, for the time being. And as I said, I would imagine that the geopolitical situation at least is part of that ambivalence, of that situation, but also, as we also talked about already, the state of legitimacy of that alphabetic shift is at least not universally affirmed by everyone, right? Or the enthusiasm that you meet on the streets is debatable. There is groups like Kazakh Grammar and others who obviously are. If you go to those places where I usually work in rural areas and small towns, yes, it is around, but it's not really that people think, wow, this is a game changer, right? It doesn't seem so to me. And you have to do it in some spheres. You would like to do it in other spheres. You move back and forth between different positions on that. But it's not that people think there is nothing more important that we have to do in our contemporary life. But nevertheless, it has an impact already now. You have the Latin characters that do exist, that are around. People who wear T-shirts where it says Kazakh Söyle or other things. You use it in social media to a certain degree, as you also explained. It is you have all the renaming or the multiple and sometimes not multiple usage of characters in public, in street names, in city names, in village names. I'm not sure if Aziz will talk about the issue of the minorities. At least that's what he did a few weeks ago when we met in Lisbon, which is a concern. And the other thing, and maybe this would be a debate, we could go on for hours and hours in detail, is to what degree is what we are currently seeing also, let's put it different. While there is an increasing role and relevance of Kazakh language in public, in documents, in everything else, there is a debate. I think Alina was talking about that. To what degree is there at the same time a misspelling, a misusage, a misinterpretation of Kazakh words? And that from a puristic point of view, that is true. And the Kazakh language has, to my experience, has changed in the last 30 years. And it's partly because all of a sudden people started speaking Kazakh who hadn't used this as their mother tongue from early childhood on, and they speak it in a different way, as the persons that she would talk about explained, and that is usually urbanized people, middle class people, so they do have more of an impact in public, at least, than the peasants that I typically used to live about, or the pastoralists in Mongolia. So you do have changes over time. I would say Kazakh, as it used in public or in media, is a softer version of the Kazakh, at least that I learned in rural areas. You have the debates on particular readings and spellings, and I should confess here, I said it too. I'm with Alex and I'm with President Tokayev. I think the Y is just it just doesn't make any sense. You can debate on K or Q or whatever. You can debate on everything, and it's not us to decide anyway. You can debate if it's really A or Y, and you can debate on the different U and U's, and I think the W is actually a good idea because that really reflects what the sound is all about. It's not a pure vowel. You can see Alex agreeing with me. But the interesting thing from an institutional point, and I just see, I forgot one slide in here, where you would see the writing of the university with which we collaborate, which is Jetesu State University. There is at least half a dozen different writings of the term Jetesu, the southeastern part of Kazakhstan, and the one that the university has now decided for the last years to use is, I'm just saying, it's Zhetysyu. And you could obviously argue this is just totally wrong, because here the Y is not even used for the il, but it is actually used for the I, for the dot, for the I with a dot, right? And the reason for that, I'm sure, I didn't ask them, is because that's how you write it in Russian. Right? That's how you write it in Russian, because the Kazakh E is pronounced in a very specific way, others different from other Turkic languages, which to Russian speakers apparently sound more like an E than anything else. So they write, so those people who introduce a Latinized writing of that do actually use the Russian version of the name. And I'm not making any judgments here on that, I'm just observing that's part of an familiarity. Well, you use, of course, language rules and writing rules in the way that you have been trained in with that, and the way that you know that other people will understand what you're actually meaning with that. That's the idea of an institution, is to create some kind of mutual communication and interaction and predictability that allows you to, that makes you sure that, sorry?
Including conflictual communication.
Well, that's true. Yes, if you want to, that's true. If you don't think of it, then usually not, because you want to be understood. That's the aim of language. But you can use it, obviously, in other things. That's when you have institutional changes or institutional ruptures, exactly. Yeah. So, as we heard, it's a top-down plan, but one that is meandering around for a while, which obviously leads exactly to that, a lack of predictability. If an institution, we all know that institutions are never followed by everyone at every moment, right? There is no red light. We discussed it yesterday when coming home from our drink. There is no place, not even Switzerland, not even Zurich, where a red light necessarily means that people actually don't cross the street, right? You do. But you do know what you have to expect if you do that, and what is the probability of being sanctioned, what is the probability of being considered doing misconduct. And pretty much the same is happening, of course, when you write or when you talk with people. If there's a limit where you wouldn't be understood anymore, then the communication would fail, and that is a potential danger whenever you have different institutions for the same things running at the same time, right? That's I think a fundamental thing. You have competing institutions for the same issues to be solved as a communication problem, as a social interaction situation. How do you deal with that? And then it becomes, as you just met, it becomes also a question of power. Who is defining what institutions are relevant? How do we enforce them or not? What do we do with people who don't follow institutions? What do we do with people who are not willing to learn Kazakh? What are we do? All these questions they come up with. Any type of institution building and institutional change is shaped by power asymmetries in society, and that is not different in this case. The question is here that there has been a change of bargaining power, obviously, between Russian speakers and Kazakh speakers within Kazakhstan and beyond. But still, it is, to a certain degree, as it is a top-down project, a process that is largely, to a large extent, shaped by intellectuals, by academics, by politicians. And that's why I was curious about the dialect question just a minute ago. I remember, back 100 years or so ago, when the Finns or the Norwegians started to think about having a literary language of their own. Sorry? Kalevala and Nynorsk. So what they did is went to the most remotest parts of the country to find out what is the most original version of Norwegian or Finnish.
Most not Danish.
Most not Danish. Of course, that's the point, exactly. That is something that apparently doesn't take place, or hadn't take place anyway in Central Asia, which you could, is it?
It happened in the early Soviet period and the late imperial period.
But also by linguists sent from the center to a certain degree, no?
Both local and central.
Yeah, okay, that would be an interesting, because I just thought, is there a Soviet legacy in that, and how will we discuss on that? That would be to talk about. And then, of course, it's very difficult to predict what would be the outcome of that. What is the short-term and the long-term costs and benefits in a way, you could, in any institution, you could say, okay, if you know that you want to change, it might be better to do it as quick as possible, because the long-term costs will accelerate the longer you wait, because the more and more generations you have that grow up with a script that they actually cannot use anymore. That is very difficult to predict. So to sum up, there is on the one hand side a very delicate geopolitical configuration. Any institutional change is shaped by path dependencies, and in this case, some of that are unconscious. If people, and we know that, and I'm not talking about Almaty elites, I'm talking about local elites or people who teach in universities like in Taldyqurghan, who think and dream in Russian, and process that into the way how they implement these processes in their heads and in their usage, and what comes out of that, I think, is an interesting case. But also a change of bargaining power among the relevant stakeholders. And finally, I think we had that briefly already. It's also a question, yes, how do we actually, what do we define as the role, but also the basis of any standard literary language? Should it reflect how people actually speak? There's a strong tendency as far as among the people I know in Kazakhstan, to think of the literary language as being the default solution that is correct, and if people don't speak like that, they speak wrong, rather than the other way around. You could, and how is that relation? And I end with a similar picture, actually, as Juldus. And for those, is there something that strikes you here?
There's two types of Cyrillic, but they look the same? Or
No.
is it repeated?
No.
Why not?
Is the first
The
K?
first one K is a qad.
That's a code. Yeah,
it
yeah,
does? Oh,
Which
it
is,
does
yes,
have the tail.
that's the Q. That's what
see.
you write as in the Q. That's right. No, the thing is, here's 3 and here's 2, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which one is missing?
The Kazakh.
Of course. And I wonder how many people actually ever noticed that the Kazakh version is actually missing here. It's the Russian and the English only.
Did you just pull over on the side?
I
of the road
did.
to take
Yes, I did, because I thought it was so great. But you see, this is usually a totally empty street leading to Üştebe. There's a lot of cars running, comparatively for Kazakhstani standards. This is a place, this is not only the place where the Kazakh version here is missing. Üştebe, that's where the cars come from, is actually the hometown of the family of the president, who had the 100th anniversary of his father's birth on that day. That's why we went there. And I just thought it's funny to see.
You said Kazakh is missing. What would it be in Kazakh?
It's Üsh, so you would have a different, you would have a different, and you would obviously have the European instead of that. That's it. You don't need it, obviously, because everyone can read it that way. Even if you don't know, even those who don't know Russian would be able to read it. So that's another thing about institutions. Why would you have parallel institutions if you actually...
It's not going to fit on the sign.
Probably that's why. Okay. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker, and the last speaker for this morning, is Aziz El-Bikura, who's a researcher at the ECMI, which stands for European Center for Minority Issues.
Yes.
His main research interests include nation building, political mobilization, official recognition, and socio-economic participation, particularly in post-Soviet countries. He's also the assistant editor of the Journal of Ethnopolitics and Minority Issues in Europe. Aziz is a PhD candidate at the Europa Universität Flensburg.
Yes.
In his doctoral project, he looks at the impact of the introduction of the Latin alphabet in Kazakhstan on national minorities.
Thank you.
It's perfect.
Thank you so much.
It's a perfect topic.
Thank you once again, Peter, Frank, also Peter, and all the colleagues for bringing us here. And I think it's a fascinating constellation of people. I'm very happy and to be presenting. So I also have several disclaimers to open with. I am not a linguist. I come from political science. So if I'm over-explaining some things, just bear with me because I'm trying to explain them to myself as well as I go. And So this is part of my PhD project. The way it goes in Germany, it can be a publication based. So I'm talking about the first sort of paper, which is a discourse analysis about Latinization that's taking place in Kazakhstan. Then the second paper, I will look at language attitudes of Russian, non-Russian speaking national minorities about this changing scripts, which hopefully I will co-author with Jules Douce, who's my second PhD supervisor. And the third one, I'll try to frame Latinization, putting it in this wider geopolitical network, see how Russia, Turkey, and whole like regional integration dynamics influence the process. Right. So, yeah, I think I'm quite lucky that all this has been already discussed by Jules Douce and Peter and also Alex to a certain extent and Alina. So I'll not go into that much detail to save time. So basically, yeah, it's the key milestones of how Latinization actually came about in Kazakhstan already in the 90s, and then the latest development being the introduction of the common Turkic alphabet. I think also Turkey seems to have long-lasting plans changing the name of the region to Turkestan officially, which triggered some people, including Tajiks, who don't identify as Turks but rather Persians. This is where I come from originally too, so I have my reservations there as well. But yeah, in several alphabet versions, the first one, and then this with a lot of apostrophes, and yeah, the latest being 21, which I think is the official, like not officially adopted yet, but what people are trying to work off. And here I tried to break down what were the main motivations, and most of these points come from the 2007 so-called analytical note, which was commissioned by the president and carried out by the Ministry of Education. And so they came up with these three categories of why Latinization is needed in Kazakhstan. First being political, so to strengthen the Kazakh national identity and strengthen its status and like the symbolical power of the language. I also think it's an interesting point about path dependency. So some scholars like Kumar and Yergalieva argue that the Kazakh administration is trying to get away from the Soviet style of implementing language reforms, but it exactly repeats the same procedure. So trying to tying the language, identity, territory together, and while carrying language policies. And then obviously decolonization, and Cyrillic is seen as one of the signs of it. So here the administrators argue that Cyrillic has been enforced. So Kazakh people never really chose using Cyrillic for their alphabet as many other Central Asian nations. And then that it was Nazarbayev's personal interest, he was pushing for it himself, sort of seeing it as his dream project. Of course there are linguistic motivations, so that Cyrillic has impacted the way Kazakh looks, but also sounds. So some scholars argue that before introduction of Cyrillic, Kazakh did sound very different than it does now. And last is the economic reasons, modernization, which we learned people don't really give a crap about. So it's for externals. I kind of had the similar hunch, but yeah, I'm happy that it's verified. And then enhancing access to new technologies, so that Latin-based Kazakh would be more practical when it comes to IT and global markets, and also for science and so on. And of course, as a language policy, it faces a lot of criticism, both from public and scholars. So first is, of course, the budget. These are the figures, the only available figures are from 2018. And back then it was estimated that it would cost around 664 million USD, which was almost 40% of Kazakhstan's GDP back then, which I think is quite a lot of money. And as we learned already from previous speakers, that it's a very fragmented reform, rarely involving any kind of public participation, so it was never introduced to public for consultation and feedback. The only time public, I think, was vocal when the alphabet versions were tested and people were not happy. and that it's rather a symbolic project, doesn't really address the inequalities among different language speakers. For example, Julduz in one of her papers argues that it has nothing to do with the status of Kazakh. So the alphabet script wouldn't change the role of Kazakh. So people who speak Russian, actually, especially in urban territories, have much more socio-economic opportunities than purely Kazakh-speaking people. And of course, there are also political implications. Kazakhstan having the largest Russian-speaking population, both with the titular nation and minorities. So the biggest Russian-speaking minority, or Russian minority, lives in the country. And that was recognized by Nazarbayev as well, who said that there's still time for Kazakhstan and Kazakh language to fulfill their unifying role. So he was aware that Kazakh was not as popular as Russian, and that Cyrillic and Kazakh has to be treated as carefully because this was historically advantage of Kazakh people, that their proficiency in Russian. And as you can see from the graphs here, the level of the proficiency levels between non-Russian speaking minorities and some Russian speaking minorities when it comes to Kazakh is quite drastic. So Russian is spoken almost by everyone, but when it comes to Kazakh, you see differences here. So with Russian speaking national minorities, it barely goes over 25%, while most of non-Russian speaking minorities actually speak quite good Kazakh. And that made me think what might be the actual impact of Latinization on national minorities. As Julduz was saying in her slides, that by administrators it's thought that it is only impacting those who are the native speakers, who speak Kazakh as their native language. But when it comes to language alphabet changes, some scholars argue that, of course, it's not only a mechanical thing, right? It involves different kind of issues. It's psycholinguistic aspects, the way it's the cognition, how people learn new writing systems. And apart from that, Kazakhstan being quite a diverse country with the biggest Russian population, I was wondering if actually this alphabet shift will change the language attractiveness for national minorities. So will this graph continue declining when Kazakh actually does shift to Latin? So will less and less people learn Kazakh, and how will this impact those who actually use Kazakh? Will they be still attracted? Will their school kids go to Kazakh language schools? And to do so, first I wanted to see what are the major themes, how it's framed in the media in Kazakhstan. So what I did for the first time in my research career, I tried to resort to the corpus linguistics, so to see what are the main themes. And for that, I compiled two different corpora. First is a state corpus consisting of articles deriving from these four media, just short of 100,000 words. And then the non-state corpus, a bit less. And with an asterisk, Sputnik KZ is not really a Kazakh non-state media. This is owned by the Russian state corporation, but I included them just to see if this reflects in my selection, if they are outlier or not. And I'll show the results later. And so after compiling this corpora, I then ran different kind of analysis. So frequency analysis that shows how much a certain word, how frequently it is used. And then the collocation is showing what a certain keyword is used in association with, so what kind of words are associated mostly with that word. And concordant lines, in the software I use, it's also called keyword in context. It shows you in a longer sentence what is actually like words around this keyword. And the keywords I used for this presentation are these four: transition, alphabet, Latin alphabet, and language. And the research questions I had were three. So what are the main narratives surrounding Latinization in this Russian language media corpus? And are they different? So is the state corpus in any way different from non-state? Do they use different narratives? And finally, if in any of those the needs and interests of minorities come up at all. So for the first research question, so what are the main narratives? So in my frequency analysis, this is the top 30 frequencies, both in state and non-state. As you can see, they're quite similar, especially in top 10. So the most frequent words are language, alphabet, different cases of alphabet, Latin alphabet or Latinica, and переход, which is transition. So I then use this as my basis, as entry point. This is why these 4 became my keywords. And interestingly, as you see in the very bottom, out of these almost 200K words, the word minority featured from 1 to 3 times. So already that indicated to me that, okay, minorities will not feature here. Don't have high hopes. And I tried to categorize the frequency words here into themes already here. So both in the state and non-state corpora, the main categories of keywords were language, alphabet, Latin alphabet, then Kazakhstan being framed as a country, as a decision maker, government and leadership and their role in this process of Latinization, public, meaning the civil society and public consultancies. Kazakh identity was an interesting one, including the word Turkic or Turkski and so on. Transition, the newness of the alphabet, modernization, which we now know doesn't mean anything, education, and culture, the temporal context, and opinions and statements, so experts being asked to share their opinions. Right. And then I moved to collocations, so I think this is an interesting one. This shows like what exactly which keyword is associated with which words. So the software I use, wherever you have a keyword which has a score of 3.0 or higher, that means that this word is significantly frequently more used than any other random word. So I selected the ones that are higher. So for example, for language keyword, for state, the biggest collocates were interethnic, international, and communication. And usually these are the words that are associated with the Russian language. So Russian language being used as a language of interethnic communication. But interestingly here, this was referring to Kazakh, which I was surprised. So Kazakh was started to be narrated as a language of interethnic international communication, replacing the role that used to be assumed by the Russian language so far. For non-state, the biggest collocates were the words being published and will learn, sort of conditioning the audience that, yeah, the school children will be learning the new Latin alphabet. For the keyword transition, when it comes to the state corpus, these are the words determined step by step, Latin alphabet significance, and so on. So showing that framing Latinization as a process, that it's going according to the plan, that it is of a significance, and so on. For the non-state, it's factual, determined, will ensure, will bring closer, gradual, facilitate, and so on. So sort of very positive framing of Latinization. And of course people, sort of indicating that public actually is included in some way, doesn't necessarily reflect the reality. Then alphabet, this mainly derives from the news items about different versions of alphabet being introduced. So you have basic, alphabet, symbols, Latin, and so on. And quite different for non-state. Here the main arguments were that it's closer to the science, so it's better suited for mathematical reflection of the Kazakh language, and its linguists are involved. And for the last keyword, Latin alphabet or Latinica in Russian, the biggest collocate for state was transition. Naturally, sort of showing that it is happening, transition is there. And for non-state, it was script, standard, basic, and historical. So non-state media was trying to frame Latinization as something of historical significance. And the last analysis, or the last tool I have used, is the concordance lines. So down in the table, you can see how it looks in the software I use. So you have a keyword,
And then it shows what are the words on its left and on its right. And it sort of allows you to see what is the main theme or the main argument. So what I did is I ran through 800 concordant lines, so the top 100 for each keyword in both corpora. And then I saw if there's any theme that occurs twice, at least. And then I assigned a category or a code, if you will. So for example, the first one says that the transition does not mean abandoning Russian language. So this I coded as non-Russian, being like it doesn't affect Russians. Then this one is talking about the new version of alphabet being introduced. So I coded this as an alphabet version. The next one, a speaker is arguing that it will actually facilitate learning of Kazakh, the new alphabet. So I coded this as an easy Kazakh language learning. And the last one is again non-Russian. So here the quote is that Latinization will first of all affect Kazakh language. Right. So here I summarized all the topics, but there were much more. These are the biggest topics that were recurring several times. So for the keyword transition, as you see for the state, the biggest topics that derive from the corpora are historical necessity and global integration. So the state framing it as a global something for global integration and as a historical necessity that is the call of the times. And for non-state, also historical necessity and Nazarbayev. So Nazarbayev coming up because he was quoted. So he used to talk a lot about this, or media used to quote him quite often. That's why he comes up in corpus frequently. And for the keyword alphabet, most obviously the alphabet version being the biggest theme, and then the improvements showing that it is still not there, the final version of the alphabet, and similar for the non-state. I think this is quite a technical one. For the Latin alphabet, we have support, so meaning that speakers or media text generally having a positive framing of the Latinization and arguing that it is way better suited for IT purposes and accessing global markets, while the non-state media are arguing that it wouldn't affect Russian speakers, so this is exclusively for the Kazakh language and that Russian speakers shouldn't worry. And past cases is media referring to the 1920s where Kazakhstan had Latin introduced, so arguing that this is not the first time for our nation. We can do this again. For example, one person was quoted saying, "My parents actually learned this, and it shouldn't be a problem for elder generation again to learn Latin." And for the keyword language, the main arguments were that Kazakh will facilitate learning of English as well, because now we have Latin script. So you don't have to learn it additionally one more time. And support coming up again. And Nazarbayev is there still. And easy English being the biggest recurring theme to... Right. And in total, across the complete corpora, so support and global integration are the biggest themes when it comes to the state media. And for the non-state, is Nazarbayev, surprisingly still, and easy English. And here, just for this presentation, I also tried to see what are the main narratives around Russian and Cyrillic being like the main antagonist of Kazakh and Latin. So what I tried to see if how these are perceived, or what media says specifically about these two keywords. So for the keyword Russian among state media, there's a big emphasis on the rights of Russian speakers. So the main argument being that Latinization will not affect the rights of the Russian speakers, and then preservation of Russian. So people calling for a very careful treatment of Russian, that it is the historical advantage of Kazakh nation that the knowledge of Russian is so high, so it should remain the same way. And for the Cyrillic among the state corpus, main themes were the policy announcements, usually by Nazarbayev again, that it should be a natural, smooth process. So switch from Cyrillic will be completely natural, and it should be a successful procedure, and it facilitates integration. This is more tied to Latin, I think. And when it comes to the non-state corpus, so for the Russian, it is a bit more nuanced than state. So it kind of reflects the state narrative, but then there's an additional one, concerns about the impact on the role of Russian. So non-state media talking about that the departure from Cyrillic in long run can weaken the position of the Russian language, and that it might also suggest Russians' involvement in protecting Russian language or developing it in the entire post-Soviet state. And for Cyrillic, it is again policy announcements by Nazarbayev, and technical aspects are mentioned. And here, the concordant lines, so the keywords in context tool, I'm trying to compare here. So the emphasis on the rights of Russian speakers and an historical legacy. So sort of Cyrillic still is presented something of very important significance. It is at the same time a colonial tool. So for the second research question, are the state narratives and non-state narratives any different? As you might say, not really, because they use similar narratives, and I think it also has to do with the media landscape in Kazakhstan in general. Because what I saw is that non-state media almost in all cases quoting state media, so you don't really have different kind of content to work with, and also has to do with the freedom of speech in Kazakhstan. But the main arguments about Latinization in both corpora is that it is a Latinization seen as a modernizing force, and it is a symbol of Kazakhstan's global integration, and using this very optimistic official tone. So for example, one of the cases that Nazarbayev used Cyrillic to write the name of the party, the leading party of Kazakhstan. So here, this is supposed to be his handwriting, and how he has written the name of the party, which is the big ruling party in Kazakhstan, in Cyrillic. And then here on the right, you see the comments where people still argue. The first person saying, I support Cyrillic, and then others arguing that we support Latin. So people are still undecided. And the case that I mentioned about Sputnik being an outlier. So this doesn't really come up in my corpus analysis, but I try to see manually what are the main narratives there, because it is quite a different media resource in Kazakhstan. So it is Russia-owned news agency. It is present in almost all post-Soviet countries with different domain names, and in Kazakhstan it is Sputnik.kz. So they were the main sort of, or the only one I've come across who had some kind of critical take on Latinization, or very frequently publishing articles about Latinization and ridiculing the procedure. So for example, it uses the titles like Operation Q, referring to the word Kazakh written through Q, and also referring to the old Soviet movie, and other adventures of the Latin alphabet in Astana. So this is an interesting piece. So these are the screenshots from that article. Here the author is walking around Astana and taking pictures of different kind of signs. And since there's not a single approved alphabet, different versions of the alphabet are used for different purposes. So you see here, for example, the name of the street is written in 3 different versions of the Latin. Here, here, and here. And they use very emotionally colored words here. So the way I want to spell it. I mean, it doesn't necessarily translate from Russian that good, but yeah, sort of making fun of how these look, and that people are so premature of implementing it while there's still no official alphabet being approved. And also, they publish quite a lot of interviews with different kind of experts, but none of them are from Kazakhstan, surprisingly. So the first example, the Safonova saying transition to Latin script will not affect the language skills of Kazakh-speaking people, so that meaning that Kazakh will not be known better, so the script wouldn't help. She's from Russia. And the Moldovan expert arguing that after the transition to Latin alphabet, the desire to read the books may disappear. So sort of he was referring to different cases, including Uzbekistan, which is the biggest, like a scarecrow for Kazakhstan, of the public media called Vremya or Time, which published an interview with an expert saying we are actually against Latinization. And but this also doesn't really come up in the corpus because these are very, very frequently low. And of course, the last one, do state and non-state narratives actually include any kind of minority angle? And as you might have guessed, not really, except for Russian speakers. So Russian speakers being sort of like a red flag, or the biggest community also having such a popular kin state right across the border, they're the only ones who come up in any kind of narrative. So other minorities, including those who speak Kazakh, way better, or using it way higher than Russian-speaking minorities, are not included at all. So the narratives are quite Kazakh-centric, in line with official discourse, despite this civic identity discourse, which also suggests lack of communication of how the reform might actually impact national minorities. Because when I was talking to some of the minority representatives, to the Uyghur person, his idea was that if Kazakhstan goes through with Latin, they will change their script as well, so Uyghur minority. Because they don't see having two different scripts, the reason for having two different scripts. And Uzbeks might follow suit. And Uzbeks are an interesting case because Uzbekistan is using Latin, while Uzbek schools in Kazakhstan still using textbooks in Cyrillic. And this kind of approach, of course, has its own limitations. So first, being translated from Russian into English and representative. So I am aware that this corpus is quite small, and it's text focused. So when it comes to alphabet, I think it's not the best because it loses these visual nuances. And the representatives, as indicated by the Sputnik KZ case, you don't really see the outliers. And overall, the media limitations in Kazakhstan not being the most free when it comes to the freedom of speech. And what I will try to do next is probably expand my corpora to see if I can include more data and use different keywords to see if this yields different results, and sentiment analysis. And I also want to see if actually minorities feature in Kazakh media in general, and then compared to this different corpus, because I'm trying to see if minorities actually, like anything related to minority policies, is it something discussed, or is it just something that is not discussed when it comes to Latinization? Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
I have a couple of questions. Do you think that Kazakh media outlets would provide a slightly different picture? Because I think you focus mostly on Russian media.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you think it matters, and if yes, how? And then a more general, maybe it's not really a question, it's an observation, that your talk made me think of our earlier discussion over modernity, whether or not it's an issue. And I'm thinking maybe modernity is a bit of a red herring in the sense that it's a term, as a conceptual item, it's an elusive one. Maybe people don't want to use the word modern. It's a slippery one. We use it as social scientists or whatever. But a lot of the items in your list, I'm thinking of English, I'm thinking of maths, I'm thinking of tech, I'm thinking of global integration, I'm thinking of historical necessity, kind of point in direction of, stuff that we might wish to call, kind of bracket as modernity, even though people don't use the word, because perhaps it's loaded in ways that we don't see, because people don't want to think of themselves as needing modernity. They might, think,
Uzbeks or Moldovans.
Right, exactly. And yet, if you read between the lines of some of this stuff, you're like, well, this stuff, can translate as modernity. Just a thought. I'm throwing it up there.
So, thank you, Theo. First question, To be honest, I haven't looked in Kazakh language media. I don't really read Kazakh. I speak Uzbek. That does not really help me. But what I saw in Yıldız's slides when it comes to the Kazakh language, what I noticed that the themes were quite similar to what my results showed. So it's the same themes, like Kazakh Latinization being framed as this modernity tool, purifying the language again, or decolonizing and being better suited for the pronunciation of Kazakh, or like rectifying the way it used to be pronounced. So I think it might be similar when it comes to the recurring topics, but I have to have a look because that was sort of one of my next future steps, just to see how it is. And for modernity, I guess it's a good point, and you might be right. It's different like facets of this big concept, and might be, and when it comes to like the words or the choice of words being used in media, maybe modernity, it is something like too abstract, but it's still used quite a lot. Like modernizacja, the word is used very, very often, and yeah, it came up in my frequency analysis as well. It's sort of, I think it's like a dual meaning, modernizacja being like the modernization of the Kazakh language through the alphabet. At least this is my interpretation, other than modernization of the country. So using Latin, like joining the club of countries who actually use Latin, like West, of course, right? And having access. But then I also saw people arguing like, that why do you think this will help like join the, like the main argument being like it is easier for foreigners to learn Kazakh, right? But and then there's still some counterpoints to this, meaning that okay, the language, like the letters will be Latin, but the language is still Kazakh. It's not English. Like you still have to learn the language, regardless the way the visual tools. So, but I'll think about that. Thanks. Thank you.